One as a member, identify that as well.
Hi, good morning. This is John Shantz with Comcast.
This is Leonard Charles with Morgan Murphy Media.
This is Marcia Brooks from the WGBH National Center for Accessible Media.
This is Michael Bennett with Bennett & Bennett on behalf of the Rural Telecommunications Group.
Good morning, Craig Donaldson from Intrado.
Paul Brenner with MS Communications.
Good morning, Becky Berger, State of Montana.
Kevin McGinnis, National Association of State EMS Officials.
Bob Mosley, Fraternal Order of Police.
Bob Gabrielli, DirecTV.
Anyone else?
With that, let's call the meeting of the CSRIC quarterly meeting, December 13th, 2010, to order. I'd like to greet all of you by saying thanks for braving the weather, if you had to do that, and coming to the meeting today. Couple reminders, of course, if you're on the phone, please mute your phone unless you are going to speak to the group, and those of us around the table, please be sure to speak into the microphone, and please indicate your name prior to speaking. So again, welcome, thank you for coming, and with that, we'll turn it over to Jeff.
Okay. Let me add my greetings. We're running a little thin this morning because we're having trouble too. It's kind of ironic, you know. Folks traveling across the country are here, and people living in D.C. are having trouble getting to work. But that is a fact of the matter. So I think that, I know in Jamie's case, Jamie Barnett, who is going to be delivering opening remarks, he won't be here, but that's not because of the weather. He was called away to the White House, and I'll be serving in his place today. So if things seem a little frazzled this morning, that's why, and I appreciate your patience with us. So let me officially open the meeting. Welcome you again. The reports have been distributed. We've gone through a process of getting your feedback, and we're looking forward to hearing the readouts today and voting on the final reports that we'll be hearing about. So with that, I will turn it back over to Bill, and we'll take it away.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I think we'll be able to move through our meeting pretty efficiently today. We have, we have two final reports that are being presented for a vote. One is Working Group 7 for Pandemic Planning Priority Service Requirements. The other is Working Group 8, ISP Network Protection Practices. I think we'll have rich discussion of both of those a little bit later on. We'll also have readouts from the 5 remaining active working groups. Those reports will be voted out in the March meeting. So again, let me remind everyone on the bridge to mute your lines unless you're speaking. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jeff Goldthorpe again for some remarks representing Admiral Barnett. Jeff?
Thanks, Bill. I did have a chance to talk to Jamie before the meeting today, and he briefed me on what he wanted to say to you. So let me just kind of go through the high points of that. First of all, he's very appreciative of the work of Chris and Bill, all the efforts that you two have put in over the months here, and will continue to put in as we roll forward to March. And also a special thanks to Ingrid Caples, Jerry Wade, John Morris, and Richard Lynch, the co-chairs of Working Group 7 and Working Group 8, respectively, for all the hard work they've put into the reports that we'll be hearing about today. It's also a special occasion for Julie Thomas, and I'm not sure, is Julie here today?
She was a victim of the weather.
Oh, okay. Well, so Julie Thomas is the co-chair, or one of the co-chairs for the CSRIC Steering Committee. I've been working closely with Julie since we started, and she'll be moving on to another job at AT&T, and we'll have a new co-chair of the CSRIC that I guess Bill, we might be hearing more about that today. But I wanted to extend my personal appreciation to Julie, and thanks to Julie for all the work that she's done, and I've appreciated working with her. Now, and thanks all of you for, as Bill said, for braving the weather and getting here and working with us. Last time when we met. Maurice Toes is not with us, is not here today. But one of the things that Maurice said struck a chord with both Jamie and I, and that is, what is this stuff that we're doing getting used for in the end? And that's a good question. It's a reasonable question for you all to ask. So Jamie wanted to spend a few minutes today being more specific about how we have used the work that you've done and intend to use the work that's being talked about today. And Working Group 7 was a group that was formed sort of ostensibly to deal with pandemic issues. There's larger emergency communications issues at stake here when it comes to priority services, and as we all know. And of course, the FCC as well as the NCS have worked hand in hand over the years to sort of develop and promote the use of the government emergency telephone system and WPS, its wireless equivalent. It only makes sense that we're exploring and asking questions about what happens to priority services as we move into the next generation networking world. And of course, the Commission has recommendations about that specifically in the National Broadband Plan, and this is why we asked CSRIC to advise us, because it's something that we do know that we're going to have to act on. It's something where there's a large body of work at NCS already that can be leveraged, and we're looking forward to carrying that work forward. So there's specific ideas in mind about what we would do with that work. Working Group 8, which was chartered or charged to examine techniques that ISPs can take to protect their customers and their own networks from malicious traffic, is a cybersecurity topic, obviously something that we've been working on here in large measure as well. So you've probably been hearing a lot over the last few months about things that have been happening here on cybersecurity, and the work of this working group couldn't be getting finished at a more opportune time, because we're sort of wrapping up our work here. It's coming to a close now, and so this work will dovetail very nicely into things that we've already been doing. Things that have already been done by CSRIC that we've used. Last time we met, the EAS Working Group 5, issued a set of recommendations for us to extend the CAP compliance date, and we've issued an order doing just that. So we've accepted the feedback, we've acted on it, and created, I think, additional clarity in that space by doing so. We've got Working Group 4B working on Next Generation 911, and there's work underway here right now on an NOI on Next Generation 911. And of course, that work will be informed in large measure by the work that Lori and Brian are doing. So you can see, I mean, that's just a sample of how the work of CSRIC has a direct impact on things that are happening here, how we use it every day. And I'm sure Jamie would say it himself, I mean, can't thank you enough for all the work that you and the folks that are working on the working groups have done. So with that, I'm going to close my remarks on Jamie's behalf. Thank you again for coming. Wish you all a happy holiday season, and I'm looking forward to the meeting in front of us.
Thanks, Jeff. Perhaps this would be a good opportunity for me to introduce briefly Julie Thomas's successor. That's Liz Gunn. Liz, if you would stand up, I'd encourage anyone to get to meet Liz after the meeting adjourns, and she'll be picking up right where Julie left off, and I'm sure she's looking forward to meeting each and all of you to get started on the work. We will go right into our final reports at this point in time, and we'd like to start with Working Group 7, Pandemic Planning, Priority Service Requirements. The presenter will be Ingrid Cables, Chief Technology Officer, Office of Preparedness and Emergency Operations of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So we'll get the presentation going now. Is Ingrid? Okay. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Wade. I am with Sprint. I'm the Director of Network Development within the network organization. And Ingrid, who was announced as the CTO of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We'd like to welcome you all this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to present the findings of Working Group 7. Working Group 7 was asked to prepare a report regarding the planning for national security and emergency preparedness next generation priority services during pandemic events. So we are here today to provide a readout of our 80-plus page report in a limited amount of slides and hopefully about 15 minutes of your time. So it was a challenge to get all the information down to that, but we've done our best to do that this morning. So if I could go to the next slide. Our agenda for today is really, and Ingrid and I will share the presentation itself. We'll talk about the introduction, introduce you to the members of our team, talk about the description of what our team was tasked with and the assigned tasks along with that, preparing the finalization of the report and what went into finalizing the report that you all have in front of you this morning, talk about the report structure, the focus areas, the deliverables that we were asked to pull together around service requirements, implementation strategy, findings, and key recommendations, and then entertain any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. So the next slide actually has a listing of the working group members of Working Group 7. We had a very good mix of representation across the telecommunications industry, across government agencies, and also across academia, with many of the members very actively involved in this team. Within the 8 or 9 months that we've spent working on this team, we actually spent a lot of time together. We actually split out into 3 different sub-teams as part of the effort, and then in the late September timeframe, we all came back together, actually met here in D.C., actually came to this building and met with Jeff on a Monday morning, and then spent the rest of the week together, pulling together all the information within the report. So as you can see, we've got many different companies represented here, and a very good mix of talent and knowledge from a team standpoint. Next slide. So our description was really to address, in the event of a major outbreak of infectious disease, there will be a tendency for large groups of people to telecommunicate to avoid clustering in common locations. So basically, going from a urban to a more suburban residential type of access to the communications networks in a time of pandemic planning and pandemic emergency. So today we actually have 2 systems. We have the GET system, the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, and then also the Wireless Priority Service. So we have 2 services that we offer today in this area, and with the actual going from a circuit switched type infrastructure to an IP-based infrastructure, that's really where the challenge was put forth within this team, is we have GETS, we have WPS today. As we migrate to more IP-based services, how are we able to provide priority services within that as we migrate to IP? So it is incumbent that the network operators develop NSEP priority services for the next generation IP-based network. So that was really the description that we were given and what we were charged to work with. The next slide actually talks about the 2 specific defined tasks that we've been working on for the last many months. The first is to develop an NGN IP priority service requirements document that specifies the order of magnitude of users. So not only just voice, but voice, data, video, etc., as we try to define the types of services that this network needs to be able to provide. Also, we talk about number of priority levels. We talk about processes for authorizing people to this access, this priority access, and then also performance standards and expected cost. The second task was really to develop an implementation strategy for priority services and which type of services should be rolled out first. So, talk a little bit about preparing this final report that we're presenting today. We had a lot of assumptions that went into the document. The 4 key assumptions that we are carrying forward in presenting today. First of all, were that the previous reference reports reviewed for this effort, and there were many, were actually considered valid. So all of the reports that we reference in our document and that we've read through over the past several months were considered valid. NCS remains the executing authority for the NSEP NGN Priority Services Program. The FCC provides the legal and regulatory framework for the commercial carriers. The third is the recommendations will be implemented, and then the fourth is the Stafford Act could be invoked during a long-term pandemic. And as we went through all of these referenced reports and many pages of research that the team did, we pulled together a lot of information. We vetted this information across all the stakeholders, all the CSRIC members, keeping our individual companies informed of what we're doing, and also communicating what we feel is effectively across the organizations that we represent. So, preparing the final report, as Jeff mentioned earlier, we sent out the final report for review and asked for comments to be delivered back to our working group by the 3rd of December. We did get some comments back. We did not get any comments, no direct comments back from the CSRIC working committee here, but we did get some comments back from our working members of our team through their organization. So we took those comments into consideration as we worked through the final document. We had 3 changes that added or slightly modified existing text, and I'll talk about those on the next 2 slides. But we also had some very minor editorial type changes that we actually have taken into consideration and will make as part of this report. We did accept all the changes that were suggested, and we are in the process now of updating the final document. If you read down through this slide, I won't read each of these individually, but there were just some editorial comments that were made by either the team or the represented companies that the team members took into consideration. So a few websites that we didn't reference, a few acronym changes and things like that. The next slide actually talks about more of the major changes that we were provided, and 2 of these were in section 3.2. And again, as I said, we accepted these in a meeting last week. We got the report, we got the documentation and the information from the request back on the 3rd, and then we met as a team last Tuesday to go through each of these and make sure that the entire team was in agreement with those changes. So we had a change in the first paragraph on page 9, and then we also had we deleted a sentence in the last paragraph of the section on page 9 in section 3.2. I think both of these comments, Ingrid, came from your organization, if I remember. And then on page 9, in section 5.2.2, we added a statement, and this actually came from AT&T, and we actually added this statement. And I would like to read through this because I think this is a pretty important statement also. But absent some statutory protections for liability, providers of mobile data services are likely to be reluctant to offer NGN priority services for NSEP users, even if that would not be unlawful to do so. This is due to the likelihood that in localized incidents, the use of priority services by NSEP users could result in block calls or data sessions for non-priority users. Accordingly, in addition to an FCC ruling on the illegality of providing IP based on an NGN NSEP purposes, the working group team believes that the FCC and the NSEP community should provide statutory liability protections for carriers who agree to provide such NGN priority service to the NSEP users. So that was actually a comment that we added within the document itself too. On the next slide, we talk about the report structure, and we followed the standard structure that I think the other teams, the other working groups have followed. We have an executive summary and the results in brief in the very first section. Then we talk about, in the introduction, we talk about the structure and the working group members, the information that I provided earlier. Talk about the scope, the methodology, the objectives around what we are working on within this team. And then we talk about the background and really define pandemic. We define what the legacy priority services, the GETS and WPS that I talked about before, and then get more into the NSEP NGN priority services. So basically the scope, the architectural scope, and the services that we need to provide. Section 5 is the assumptions, the analysis, the findings, and the recommendations. Section 6 is the conclusions, and then we have several appendices attached to the document. Appendix A, which is important, is really the requirements. So that was really the very first item on our charter to define, and then Appendix B is actually the implementation, which is really the second deliverable that we were asked to define within this document. So with that, I will turn it over to Ingrid, and she'll talk about a little bit more information on our deliverables and also our recommendations as we move forward. Ingrid.
Okay. As Jerry mentioned, we had 2 task deliverables that we were asked to provide. One was the service requirements, which is you can find in the report, Appendix A, and pretty much that gives the breakdown of the impacts again of the a pandemic, and which is described in the main body of the report. It also talks about the existing NCS programs, your GETS, your WPS, your TSP, and then it looks at the order of the magnitude of users. And from that is kind of key here. We looked at the critical infrastructure sectors that support the critical infrastructure. These are the groups that, in addition to the government response elements, make up our NSEP community, and there's about approximately 15 million of them that make up between the 14 to 16 sectors, and all that is defined in both the main body of the report and the appendix. Then the types of services covered, and again, for the services covered here, we were looking at voice, video, and data. And then also the process for authorizing the priority access, and there's already a baseline established for that, and so those discussions are all within that, and all these things, as things move forward, need to be more refined, need to be vetted amongst the stakeholders as you get down more granular into those areas. The other area was the implementation strategy, and it looked at the strategy of how do we implement this, and there were some rather lengthy debates and discussions about that. But ultimately, each of the service providers are going to have to, have a more defined implementation plan for as they do this, and so we felt that was very strong. That would be held at a very high level within this report. So as far as the task deliverable. Then the third thing, it was really a sub, because there was really only 2 task deliverables. The sub-task deliverable was to identify costs associated with all this. And so the cost is a rough order of magnitude cost to the tune of $1.9 billion over 9 years. And those costs are broken out into 7 components. And again, these costs require vetting amongst the different stakeholder, government and industry and the users and so forth, to look at a more realistic budget. And I'm not saying that it's high, I'm not saying it's low, but is it a rough order of magnitude? The 7 areas were development in the core, development in the wireline, the wireless, the deployment, the upgrades for operations and maintenance, the costs over that period of time, and also a key factor here is the hardening of the NSEP NGN priority services. So that is what our deliverables, from our description, those were our key deliverables, and again, those can be found on Appendix A and B, and also the rough order of magnitude cost within the main report, Section 5.2.2. within this report, we had our findings, key findings. There were gaps that we identified. There were various assumptions and so forth, including some technical assumptions in one of the standards appendix. But our key findings was that as a pandemic begins, you basically will start in one area and probably spread throughout the nation. So that was kind of key. You'd start in one area. And with the pandemic, there could be waves of the pandemic, some lasting 6 to 8 weeks. It can be severe. There were some statistics out there. There's lots of statistics from 20 to 40% of the workforce, and then a certain piece of that workforce is going to be our NSCP and our critical infrastructure folks. But basically, as this occurs and folks telework, employ social distancing techniques, that traffic will move pretty much from the enterprise infrastructure to our residential infrastructure. And so when that happens, we're going to be competing. There's going to be competition for that bandwidth. This competition would have a significant impact on those folks who are trying to, at different levels. I mean, when you have folks responding to an event, there are some folks who are from the operations and planning and logistics perspective, or trying to respond to that and support the folks who are on the ground. And there are just so many aspects of that. But that traffic could shift, and we need to be able to prepare for that. So also, the other findings was that the performance level agreements don't necessarily come in place. Okay, you all are familiar with the GETS and WPS, and of course the telecommunication service priority. That it's I hate to use the term best effort, but it's those people who have those services. They should get the next access. They should get the next priority restoration or provisioning. But again, there is no necessarily service levels with that. Carriers will still need to report performance. They will need to during the event, and of course, as if it's a long pandemic, even that was recognized that reporting could be impacted. It could also be maintenance on the systems and the networks could be impacted and so forth. So all this is addressed in the report as far as our findings. Now, on these findings, the working group came up with a total of 18 recommendations. Only 6 were key. So we narrowed that down. We have provided the other 12 recommendations in the report, but we focused on 6 key recommendations and on what the FCC should do. And so these are the FCC, basically, they should initiate a rulemaking to consider the legal framework for the priority services and IP-based NGN environment, review the TSP authorization and how that impacts the broadband environment. We have the clarify rules in regard to the critical infrastructure employees and their responsibilities. You're looking at an expanded user base compared to what the TSP or the priority services are in use today. And it's not that those folks don't qualify now for priority services. It's just that there needs to be more marketing of these priority services and availability for these. And also to look at changing maybe the existing priorities to include not just the folks who are managing, but also the folks who are performing these functions. So because these folks, they definitely need to have access to the applications, they need to make telephone calls and so forth. Another recommendation is work with the executive and legislative branches to heighten the awareness for funding. As you heard, the rough order of magnitude funding was pretty significant, and they need to work to look at that. The others are, again, to provide FCC should continue to provide the legal and regulatory guidance to the NCS and the communications industry as the key stakeholders to ensure that they implement and deploy the NSCP NGN priority services And again, as quickly as possible. And you are looking at a long period of time. Even if we started in January, you would still be looking at a significant, time frame there. And also for the FCC to assist the NCS and sponsoring organizations to make sure that they are enrolling everybody who qualifies and that they actually are trained to use these services. And, that really should be a key element here. You can build it, but, they need to use it. With that, I'd like to thank the FCC and the CSRIC members for their participation, through their Working Group 7 members, and also, as well as the opportunity to address this issue. And with that, are there any questions?
Thank you. Any further questions or discussions? I see none in the room. Jim?
Are we going to vote on this document today?
Yes.
I just have a question before the vote, and that is, once we vote on this, does the working group have the ability to still go back and scrub the report for any grammatical errors, technical things that do not change the substance of the report, or once we vote on this, is it verbatim as submitted?
I think in the last meeting we had a discussion that gave the group the opportunity to make minor changes, but not anything that dealt with substance.
I have some concerns, but I'll take it offline with the co-chairs if, in fact, they have the ability to make those modifications after the vote.
Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments? If not, I think we'll move to a vote. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? All right. I think we've approved the document. Thank you so much for all your work. This is, I think, a great step forward, and we know that you and the working group did a tremendous job here, and we thank you very much for your efforts. Okay? I think we may need to change our order a bit. We have a presenter that I think is caught in transit, so what we'll do is we'll skip to the Working Group 2A readout, and I'll ask Gary Toretti. I think Gary is on the phone, so Gary, we'll get the material up for you here, and I'll ask you to go ahead and present Working Group 2A, if I could.
This is Gary Toretti from CSRIC Working Group 2A. This is the cybersecurity best practices. If the slides are up, we're on slide number 2. And really, just like last quarter, what I had talked about then was that we had actually broken the CSRIC cybersecurity best practices into 9 subgroups overall. We had verticals of wireless IP services, network, people, and legacy services, and we had horizontal groups of identity management, encryption, vulnerability management, and incident response. Each of those groups had a team lead with several people working with that group leader. And what we did also was to divide out subtopics within those groups themselves. The teams had worked, as we go to slide number 3, the teams had worked on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, coming up with the best practices overall. And then the overall Working Group 2A met on a monthly basis and reviewed the work that was coming out of the individual sub-teams. We have now completed getting all the draft in of the best practices. I have reviewed all the information that has come in and have provided feedback to each of the subgroups that are out there overall. And what we're doing now is going through a cleanup of some of the duplicates that I've seen out there, and some areas where we felt some of the best practices were maybe under the network side that needed to be moved to the identity management side, or various other subgroups that existed out there. We're now in that process of moving those items around underneath of each of the tabs that we have within our spreadsheet. So we're going through the cleanup right now. And we still are on target to have the draft to the steering committee for January 31st, 2011. There's no really open issues right now on slide number 4. All our issues have been closed at this point. And slide number 5 is really our next steps. And it's really to finish the cleanup on the best practices that we're going through right now. The consolidation, the report writing, and presentation efforts will be underway, and I'm targeting a completion around the middle of January, so we'll have that available for delivery to the steering committee on January 31st. And then the final report out to the CSRIC members is on schedule for February 10th, 2011. And Bill, that's all I have. If there are any questions.
Gary, thank you very much. Apparently there was a mix-up in getting your material here, so we weren't able to present it. So I would ask if you could forward that material here to us. We'll make sure that we get it distributed. Since it's not going to vote today and it's just an update, I don't think that's a major problem, but we'll make sure that gets distributed to all the members so everyone can see kind of where you stand.
Right, and I apologize. I got that in late to Anissa, so it's my fault for getting in late.
Okay. Any questions for Gary before we move on? Okay, Gary, thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil.
I do think our presenter has just made it in time for the Working Group 8 report. This will be the other report that we should vote out today. So let's go back to that item. And I think, John, I don't know if Jason Livingood is your only present. Okay. Come, if you would come to the microphone so people on the bridge can hear. John Morris.
So I'll be briefly presenting on behalf of my co-chair Dick Lynch and myself, but then Jason will really get the substance. So I suppose I'll just kick it off. So this is the Working Group 8, the Internet Service Providers Network Protection Practices Working Group. We have been focusing. Next slide, please. The problem we've been trying to focus on is the problem of compromised computers, botnets, home computers that have been infected by viruses and that are now ultimately controlled by global networks of hackers and other botnet operators. And I'm going to let Jason kind of more fully describe the problem and the work that we've been doing. But I mean, just to emphasize, I mean, it is a very serious problem, and I am confident that a non-trivial percentage of the people in this room have computers at home that are in fact compromised, and you guys don't know about it. I mean, it's something that is very, very prevalent, unfortunately. And so the task at hand for the group was to figure out what best practices ISPs, Internet Service Providers, who have residential consumers with compromised computers, what steps should they take to identify the problem and respond and help the consumers address the problem. And I mean, these botnets both put the information of the consumers at risk, but they also put at risk really kind of cybersecurity on our network, because it's these botnets that create the denial of service attacks. This weekend we've been hearing about denial of service attacks related to the WikiLeaks situation. Well, those are being perpetrated by the botnets that we're talking about right now. So next slide. So our expected deliverables was to try to capture the best practices of ISPs, or what ISPs are doing now, and also to try to brainstorm about what else they should be doing. To investigate and consider the privacy and policy considerations and concerns that relate to this, because I mean, the process of observing whether a user has a compromised computer does in fact observe the user's traffic, and so there are privacy and other policy concerns, and to identify technical resources for ISPs to look at in the area and make technical recommendations. Next slide, please. Participants, we had a very broad range of kind of the leading internet service providers were participating, along with content providers, key online services, important U.S. government agencies, and public interest participation. And we had regular meetings. The challenge of responding to botnets is an evolving process, really, even during our 9 months of meetings and work, we saw new things emerge. What we're presenting is really a snapshot that we certainly will recommend be kept up to date on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. This slide lists our working group participants. I won't obviously read the names, but I do want to call out two people in particular: Robert Thornberry of Bell Labs, Alcatel-Lucent, and Paul Diamond of Quest served as our best practice editors, and we do actually request on behalf of Dick Lynch and I, we request the ability to make one change to the report that you have reviewed, and that is to add an acknowledgement to these two individuals who really did a huge amount of work in terms of organizing the best practices. Added an acknowledgement to a footnote. I think that was circulated, so that is one amendment that we will want to make. And then in the process, before I turn it over to Jason, next slide, please. We did consult with a broad range of stakeholders and experts in this area who were listed up on the slide, and I don't think I need to go into those names, but so Dick Lynch, my co-chair, and I, could have presented the entire, presentation and details on the problem and what we've done, but frankly, I think our working group was full of experts, people who are far more expert than Dick or me in this area, and so we thought it best to really ask one of the experts to come in, and so we've asked Jason Livingood, who is the executive director of Internet Systems Engineering at Comcast Cable. And Comcast is really one of the leading companies in the area of kind of innovating about how to respond to botnets and compromised computers. So Jason was able to provide some very helpful advice throughout the whole process. And so Jason, if you can take it from here.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to the co-chairs. Next slide, please, which is slide 7. So I think at a high level, most people have a general understanding of what a bot is. It is short for robot. It's something that can take remote control over your computer. It is sort of an advancement on a typical virus or worm. The focus that we had here were on end-user PCs connected to ISP networks that were infected with malware that become part of bot networks. So once someone becomes infected with malware, they then can be sort of controlled in an army. These armies can be rented, typically by the hour or by the day, depending for different purposes. You might be charged differently. There's sort of an eBay marketplace that you can participate in to go and say, I want X 100,000 bots or X thousand bots in certain networks, and I want to do spamming and whatever, and there's sort of a bid system. And we had some of the experts come in and take us through that. Pretty fascinating, but also disturbing at the same time to understand that the marketplace behind these sorts of tools is extremely sophisticated, and that there's a huge economy behind it. In terms of the types of functions that those bots can perform, they can perform a wide range. It used to be that a lot of that malware was specifically targeted mainly at spam, and that's no longer the case. Now, typically, you have what's sort of called a utility bot, and that's just basically a piece of software that listens for commands. And someone can send it commands to perform an attack. They can send it commands to download new software, a whole range of different things. And it can do everything from key logging on a local computer, and that's to capture everything from login usernames and passwords to credit card information that's typed in at banking websites. Can steal files that are kept locally There have been examples of this recently in the past year of files being stolen off of corporate websites that are intellectual property, those sorts of things. They can host files that are part of a sort of illegal content network, ranging from child exploitation images to illegal music, video, and so on. And of course, sending spam is a typical one. And as we've seen recently, participating in DDoS attacks is certainly one as well. It's also important to note that the method of infection is not necessarily that someone has not done the right thing. It's not that they haven't run antivirus software. Antivirus software is not particularly effective against most malware today. It can simply be that they visit a web page. So over the weekend, as an example, there was a news story that a couple of large ad networks had malware infected in their ads, and if you went to some of the major websites that which were really in the top 20 or so websites that were infected with this, you just had to visit the web page. You didn't have to download anything. You didn't have to click on anything. Just by nature of visiting that web page, you were infected with malware. So it's a very serious problem, and if you can go to the next page, please. Next slide, slide 8. It's important to keep in mind that this threat is severe. It is growing worse. It is not stabilizing or getting better by any means. And as the folks that participated in the working group went through this, it became apparent as we went through that we were all very, very surprised, even in our own sort of limited experience, how deep this sort of underground economy that was behind malware and bot networks really was, and how pervasive this threat really was, and that it was continuing to grow. As I mentioned a moment ago on the last slide, the catch rates of preventative tools, primarily antivirus, is relatively low. And we also found, disappointingly, that remediation tools to remove that malware and sort of fix a PC would be what's described as immature, meaning it's not going to be always effective at finding malware. It won't always be effective at removing malware. Many users' only solution was to reformat their hard drives and reinstall their operating systems. As a result, the level of technical expertise to actually fix those computers is relatively high, and takes someone that's relatively sophisticated. It's not like you can go and do a web-based scan and web-based removal of these sort of things. And importantly, the working group, as we go to the next slide, tried to account for the state of this in 4 different ways. So we broke down our best practices into these key areas. The first was prevention. Given that we mentioned that prevention and sort of AV type tools is immature, this unfortunately isn't where we'd love it to be, but prevention is certainly one aspect, trying to prevent those infections before they occur. The next is detection, and this is sort of twofold. First, an ISP detecting that someone might have been infected, one of their customers or users, but also to detect the effects of the malware itself, meaning attacks, whether that's a spam attack or a DDoS attack or so on, sort of twofold detection. The next is notification, so notifying end users that there is likely a problem, and I'll talk about one of the challenges there in a second. And lastly, mitigation. So once a notification has been made, either the ISP enabling that customer or making recommendations for them to remove that malware, or for the ISP to take steps in their network to mitigate the effects that are observed on the network, whether those are attacks or so on. And of course, we also touched on an area of privacy considerations, and we did spend a lot of time talking through those things. In the course of detecting malware and in the course of trying to mitigate it, it's possible, as we went through some of the techniques, that there can be incidental contact, if you will, with personally identifiable information and email addresses and so on. And so we've documented best practices in the area of privacy to make sure that user information was stored or handled correctly. On slide 10, if you can go to recommendations, I see that's up. The industry really needs to try to try to stay one step ahead of the bad guys. There are enormous economic incentives to those folks that are part of that sort of economic underground, if you will, and it's very difficult for industry to really keep up with the rapid advancements that are being made there. But I think the concern is that if there isn't this concerted effort across industry and through government and so on, that will cause, if this continues to be a problem over the next few years, a reduced level of trust in computing, in particular in internet computing, and of course that associated network costs, including to the end users in terms of software that they would need and so on, could increase. In addition, government has a leadership role to play here. certainly in ensuring that government networks are kept safe. But the one thing that didn't make it on here but is mentioned in our document is that a number of governments around the world, including Germany and Japan, have taken additional steps to create sort of national websites to educate their citizens about malware and to provide them with tools to remediate. Again, Germany and Japan were the ones cited in our references, but that might be something as well in terms of leadership role. We also think that best practices are rapidly evolving here. Even in the 9 months that we spent, we found that some of the things were changing, and so we'd recommend that these should be reviewed every 2 years, if not more frequently. And in particular, we hope that the last two categories, mitigation and notification, are ones that can rapidly evolve, and hopefully prevention as well. Next slide. In terms of methods for sharing information with end users, those are certainly an area that can be better defined. We certainly tried to do our best to define a number of notification methods and sort of techniques. One of the things that we found and was documented in our recommendations was that there is a difficult balance between whether a malware infection is definitively 100% known versus likely, and there's an element of timeliness, if you will. So we felt that it was more important to make sure there was a timely recommendation or notification to the user that it was likely that they had malware versus waiting until you had enough information to say 100% definitive, because by that point it could be days or weeks and a lot of damage could be done to that end user, not to mention to the ISP network and other users. Certainly, though, end user awareness and behaviors can be improved. I've had a lot of direct experience with this in the last couple of weeks in our network, and certainly that is the case. And there is likely an opportunity for cross-industry coordination and communication of when these kind of threats are observed. And the last one, just to skip ahead for a second, in terms of best practices, what we talk about is ISPs really need a forum and need ways to communicate with one another, in particular with other websites, whether it's some of the large websites that participated with us, customer groups, and so on, to share information about not only the threats that they're seeing, but the best practices that they've learned in terms of notification and so on. And of course, as we mentioned before, protection of consumer information here is paramount. It's an important issue, and we tried to make sure that it was clear in our recommendations that this needs to be something that any ISP or other group that's focusing on this problem is aware of and focused on intently. So that is the high and the low, if you want to take back.
Let me just, as listening to the report that we just presented, I realized that there's one data point that I think is worth adding to what we'd put on our slides, and that is something that was very important within our group in terms of evaluating what the scope of our work was. And the best practices that we've submitted and are suggesting to be approved today are aimed at consumer residential broadband networks. And there are some parts of the best practices that may not make as much sense in enterprise networks, enterprise services, because enterprise services have, many of them have their own security offices, and so there may be some techniques that are appropriate to be done in a residential network that may be less appropriate. And so as a working group, we did focus our scope on residential broadband networks. And although many of the best practices that we've advocated are also certainly appropriate in enterprise access networks, but there are some in terms of notifying and essentially snooping on customer traffic that might be handled differently. So I just wanted to make that clarification, since it's something that was actually quite important within our working group. But with that, I think I think we're ready for any questions, and I'll probably defer to Jason if you have any.
Okay, John, let me open the floor to questions. I think if I could make an editorial comment on the point you just made, best practices and all the NRICs that I've been aware of or been involved in have been just that. And to your point, they were not defined or not intended to apply in each and every case without fail, but they're typically things that would apply in most cases. And I think it's important for all of us to remember the intent behind best practices, and I appreciate that clarification.
Well, and if I could just add on that, in this particular area, that qualification is especially important. the architecture of, for example, Jason's Comcast cable-based network is significantly different than, for example, my co-chairs Verizon's Fios-based fiber-based network, and so kind of the capabilities and the interactions within the cable plant, the cable head end, or the central office are really quite different. And so, I mean, certainly ISPs need to be able to take these practices that we recommend and figure out how best to implement them. So,
any questions or comments associated with the report? Yes.
William Brown, National Public Telecommunications Council. Question is, did you do any investigation as far as firewalls and the effectiveness of firewalls, especially at the consumer level?
Sure. So we did hear some commentary both about firewalls and antivirus systems, and I think a lot of the sense was that they were not as effective as they could be. In particular because you could be visiting a website and have a drive-by download without even knowing, and the firewall in that case would have allowed you to visit that website. So probably not incredibly effective against malware.
Other questions or comments? Seeing none in the room and hearing none on the bridge, I propose we go to vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
All right. Thanks so much to you and your team. This is an outstanding report, Dick, John, Jason, everyone that's been involved. Thank you very much. Let me turn it over to my co-chair for the following reports.
Thank you. We will next hear from Working Group 2B, which is the Media Security and Reliability Council Best Practice Update. Our presenter today will be Robert Ross, Senior VP East Coast Operations with CBS Broadcasting.
Thank you very much. It's been a busy fall for some of us, although we haven't probably made as much progress as we would like in our CSRIC duties. We have redrafted a number of the, all of the documents internally, and my intention is to present the final documents at the next meeting in Washington, and I think we're on track to be able to do that. That's it for 2B.
Ross, before we move on? Okay, thank you very much. Working Group 4B, which is a transition to NG 911. The final report is anticipated in March of 2011, and our presenter today is Lori Flaherty, who is the Program Analyst, USDOT, and also Brian Fons.
Lori and I will provide this. Working Group 4B has 4 subgroups that have been working very, very hard. There are the technical team, the operations, funding, and access. All 4 subgroups have held a number of meetings, actually in-person, conference calls, and so forth. In addition to that, we've gone through and established a pretty serious time frame, and Laurie will go through the timelines associated with these working groups, sub-working groups.
All 4 of the subgroups have submitted a draft for their piece of our report. We are going through the process of consolidating those and reviewing them in a smaller group. There are over 50 people that are part of this working group. So there's a smaller group of folks that have been designated to do that. We plan to be done with that by the end of December. Between January 1st and mid-January, the 4B working group will vote on this report so that by the middle of January, a report will be done and submitted to the steering committee in time to review for the monthly call of the steering committee, which generally happens during the last week of the month. Subsequent to that, the report will be submitted to CSRIC at large and will be ready for the March meeting. Just one note, we have tried to be as concise as possible. I shared this with the steering committee on the last call. But given the fact that our topic was rather broad, I will warn you now that this report is a little bit longer than the ones that you've seen so far. But we'll do our best to get the report to you in advance so you have ample time to review it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Brian or Lori? Okay, thanks for your hard work so far.
Next, let's go to Working Group 4C, Technical Options for E911 Location Accuracy.
Good morning, members of CSRIC. My name is Craig Frost with Verizon Wireless. I was going to split the duties with my co-chair, Steve Wisely from APCO, but he's under about 4 feet of snow in Syracuse. And went through the rolling cancellation process yesterday. So Steve's with us here with us in spirit. First slide, please. Okay. This is mostly an update from what Steve presented at the last meeting. Our conference calls have been continuing with the full 4C working group. We have increased that to a frequency of twice a week now, up from once a week. We've had 3 1.5-day face-to-face meetings. We also had a public safety only call. We found that a lot of the public safety members on the working group were having difficulty attending the face-to-face meetings due to budget constraints, so we want to make sure that they're staying well informed and feel like their voice is being heard, so we'll continue to have some public safety only sessions. We have had 2 subgroups working. We've sort of come back to being a full group now that we're working through the document, and we can move on to the next slide. Okay, the first working group is about 90% complete with their submission to the document. That was related to service types and applications, and we've identified about 20 different service types and or variants that currently require location accuracy or some kind of location reporting for E911. Next slide, please. Okay, the second subgroup was the location technology subgroup. We've broken that down into what is currently in existence and then what is in the emerging technologies bucket. We have about 6 emerging technologies that we're working through. The group is probably about 3/4 of the way through the wording and the content of their section, and this group is also looking at pieces of interoperability and ways that technologies may be able to be combined. Next slide, please. We also got a contribution from the state of California with some empirical data on E911 accuracy. We have a small group reviewing that. We're not exactly sure where the alignment is with the charter, but we're sure that it will at least be in as an appendix. We're trying to figure out how to use that data. Next slide, please. As of right now, if we look through our charter, we really don't have any items that are 100% closed out and ready. But we are making very good progress. I won't go back through all of the items of the charter, but when you look at the emerging technologies and the combinations and interoperability, that second subgroup is doing most of the work in that front, and we're making through the face-to-face meetings we've done quite a bit of discussion between the public and private sector with respect to those items. Next slide. Just closes out the remaining items from the charter, and if we move on to the last slide, I believe. The next steps, we are still in the draft report stage. We have an additional face-to-face meeting scheduled at the tail end of the ESIF meeting in Austin in January, and we're planning to have the draft report ready for delivery to this panel by the 31st of January. Any questions?
Greg, thanks so much.
Sure.
And our final report out today is Working Group 6, which is Best Practice Implementation. Our presenter today is Stacy Hartman, Director of Public Policy with Quest.
Good morning, and on behalf of Steve Melfors and I want to thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all this morning and give you a status report regarding Working Group 6 Best Practice Implementation. Probably the second slide. Do you have slides or not? Okay, we're getting there. All right. Slide 2 is just a snapshot of our description for our working group. Essentially what it says is we were tasked with looking at the 800 plus best practices, determining which of them were considered vital across communication industry segments, and then measuring implementation or providing recommendations around how to measure implementation of those best practices. Slide 3 is a list of the participants, and as you can see, we have about 20 active companies and organizations listed here. Well, just take a brief second to stop and thank all of the companies that participate for all their hard work, their dedication, and the time. We've really put in a lot of work here, and I think our end work product will really show that. All right, slide 4 is kind of a status of where we've kind of accomplished things already. We got through our first deliverable of looking at the 800 plus best practices. We put together some criteria for actually outlining how to rate and rank these as critical, highly important, or important. And then we've also documented which of these BPs should be considered vital across all communication industry segments. Now slide 5, which is up, talks about our current work activity. And here you can see that we have broken into 2 additional committees, the Education Plan Committee and the Best BP Implementation Survey Committee. Now, the Education Plan Committee is in the process of actually putting together a BP website usage survey. We've actually sent out the survey to the industry for some feedback to find out actually which best practice websites are being utilized today, how they're being utilized, how frequently, and maybe any suggestions as to how to improve those sites. In addition to that, this team is looking at a web-based and webinar education framework that could essentially be utilized as the industry as to familiarize what are best practices, how to locate them, why they're important, why they should be utilized, and why they should be implemented across our communication industry. Finally, this team is also putting together a white paper framework, which again would be another means of raising awareness of best practices. It will point out a lot of the same things the webinar education will, but will be in a different format so that we're kind of reaching out in different ways across the industry. Some of us prefer online training, others prefer reading papers, so this again will point at best practices and how to find them and encourage their use. Next, the Best Practice Implementation Survey Committee has been looking at actual ways to measure implementation of best practices. They've also been looking at ways to modify the existing best practice websites to make them not only more user-friendly, but to maybe recategorize the best practices and how they're outlined today, so that again, they'll be more useful to companies. And then finally, we're in the process of reviewing the Network Reliability Steering Committee's proposed and modified best practices. There are about 23 best practices on that list that we've been reviewing, and we'll be providing some recommendations to this council as to which ones should be approved as final best practices. Slide 6 is a timeline, which is hard to see on the screens, but it's outlined a lot of the work, the high-level work that our teams have been doing. And the key dates here essentially are near the end, to the right. Thank goodness for that, right? We're getting closer to the end of this. But we are in the process of integrating all of our reports. Our existing committees are actually finalizing their work and getting that over for integration into our running report. We will be getting that over to the steering committee by January 31st and are well on track for that. Slide 7 lists the action items. Of course, we've already closed our review of the 800 plus best practices. We've documented our findings. Our open items are to complete our committee work, to document those in our working draft report, and to liaise any issues over that are recognized to the appropriate working groups on this council. And then our final slide is the meeting schedule. You'll see that our full working group has been meeting monthly. We've also had a host of face-to-face meetings mixed in there. We have a team lead and leadership call monthly as well, and then our existing committees are meeting on a weekly basis. So that's it. Any questions from anybody about our status or where we're headed? Go ahead.
Just one question regarding the discussion we had earlier. Are you addressing anywhere in the report the notion that best practices generally apply but shouldn't be taken as mandatory or shouldn't be considered
Absolutely.
To be perfect?
That is a big driver for our team.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our work effort for today. We want to thank all of you for not only attending, but for those of you that put in hours and hours and hours of work to get some of these reports to conclusion, and we look forward to the other reports at our meeting in March. Certainly, on behalf of my association, APCO, we wish all of you very happy holidays and safe travels.
The only thing that I would add is I think you've seen today there was an effort to really try and get material out and get it circulated and get comments a little bit earlier in the process, because in our last meeting we had some concerns about making adjustments on the fly. The next meeting is in fact our last meeting as we currently know it, so deferring to a subsequent meeting is not going to be an option for us. So let me ask the working groups to pay particular attention to getting your material out earlier and getting it circulated so we can make sure that everyone who has a comment or really would like to get some input has that opportunity, and we don't get kind of boxed in by the end of our meeting. So with that, I add Chris's hopes for a happy holiday, and we'll turn it over to Jeff to wrap us up.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, let me just add one thing to what Bill said, and I think it may have been clear from his point, and that is that there is no provision for us to carry work over from this CSRIC to, say, some future CSRIC. So don't, if you're thinking that it might be possible for there to be loose ends from this CSRIC that we could take up in a subsequent council, that's not an option. Okay, so that's why the last meeting and how we handle the feedback that we get in the last meeting is vital. And so for those of you here in the room, please have a safe trip home today. It's messy outside. And for all of you, thank you. And please have a warm and happy holiday season, and we'll see you in March.